Before we start the story, remember that what you're about to hear is based on real events rebuilt from diaries, police files, and people who were there telling what happened. Some names have been changed to keep people private. Click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss stories like this again. Now, let's continue with the story. The fog came thick that October morning, sitting low over the Blue Ridge pine trees like a blanket sewn by ghosts. Deep in those mountains, the Ashwell Lodge sat crooked on its old stone base, covered in vines and silence. Local people knew to stay away, not because they were scared, but because it was just what they did. The place had a way of staying forgotten. Tucked between hills and quiet, just past the old logging road, nobody paved anymore. Eli and Micah Ashwell came back to the lodge after their grandfather died. A man people in nearby towns whispered about as both a preacher and a crazy man. He died alone in that lodge, surrounded by walls full of Bible verses and strange drawings that no church would ever recognize. The brothers, born years apart, but raised with the same strict rules, inherited not just the property, but something far more dangerous: their grandfather's religious ideas. Morning House, as it had once been called on papers and maps, was more than a home. It was a place of ceremony, a place of rules. The journals left behind, dozens of them, handwritten in the same rushed handwriting, talked about family bloodlines, holy promises, and a plan from God for marriage through purity. He called it blood marriage. The teaching twisted the Bible into something you couldn't recognize, talking about a woman chosen by fate to connect two souls in one body, a group of three made from flesh. The brothers didn't laugh it off. They studied those journals like commandments, splitting the pages between them as if they were ancient scrolls. When one read out loud, the other wrote notes. They painted symbols above each doorway, sealed windows with thick velvet curtains, and began rebuilding what they called the House of Joining. When neighbors saw lights flickering in the lodge for the first time in decades, some said a prayer, others just crossed the street. Then came the girl. Her name was Miriam, 19, maybe 20. With wide dark eyes and a laugh like river water, she'd grown up in a town 2 valleys over. No one remembered exactly when she came to work at the lodge, just that she was there, carrying baskets from the market, picking herbs by the stream, smiling too easily at anyone who asked. And then, just as suddenly, she was gone. No missing person report, no search party, just rumors, the kind that die in the mouths of people afraid to say them out loud. Some whispered she'd run off to Asheville with a boyfriend. Others claimed she'd left for religious training, but those closest to her knew something was wrong. Her cousin tried calling, her friends sent letters. There was no reply. Behind the doors of the Ashwell Lodge, the teaching of blood marriage had begun to take shape again, this time with Miriam at its center. For almost a year, Miriam was nothing more than a memory to those who had once known her. Her laughter no longer echoed through the markets. Her face no longer showed up at the Sunday stalls or along the chapel pews. The town quietly filed her away under the kind of disappearances they didn't question too deeply. But then, one fog-choked morning, just as the leaves began to yellow and curl, someone saw her. It was a farmer's wife driving past the hollow near the old game trail that ran alongside Ashwell land. She braked hard, thinking she'd seen a deer. But what she saw standing just beyond the trees made her blood run cold. Miriam, pale, barefoot, wearing a white veil that hung heavy with dew. She didn't wave, she didn't speak. She only stared as if trying to remember who she was. By the time the woman circled back with her husband, the girl was gone. No footprints, no torn lace, just a silence that felt soaked with something unspeakable. The townspeople began whispering again. Some said it was a ghost, others believed it was a warning. But when asked, Eli Ashwell simply blinked and said he hadn't seen Miriam in months. Micah, always the quieter of the two, said nothing at all. Inside the lodge, however, Miriam had never left. She had been brought into Morning House as a guest and slowly shaped into something else entirely. Her world had become limited to 3 rooms: the prayer parlor, the bridal chamber, and the purification hall. Each one was dressed in faded linens and thick dust, untouched by time or modern light. The windows had been nailed shut, the mirrors were long removed, She no longer knew what season it was. Every morning began with reading out loud. Their grandfather's words were printed on old paper, yellowed with age, and rewritten in ink by the brothers' own hands. Passages about obedience, about holy joining, about dual devotion. Miriam was told that the world outside had abandoned her, that her laughter, her name, her very identity had been a curse that needed erasing, that she was chosen. The brothers never used her name anymore. They called her bride, sometimes vessel. Micah would hum, brushing her hair, slow and careful. Eli taught her to kneel just right, her hands clasped in silence while he read from the teaching of joining. She was told to fast, to cleanse, to pray. Each day blurred into the next, and slowly Miriam began to wonder if perhaps they were right. Maybe she had been chosen. There were rules she had to follow. No questions, no mirrors, no writing unless copying holy texts. She was forbidden from talking about her life before the lodge. The girl who once skipped stones and danced in creek water no longer existed. The brothers weren't just keeping her, they were rebuilding her. And the worst part was they were almost succeeding. The days inside Morning House became slower, heavier, as if time itself followed a different rule within its crumbling walls. The air was still, but the silence was never empty. It hummed with teaching. After weeks of being alone and learning to obey, the brothers introduced Miriam to what they called the teaching of two. They spoke of it as though it were scripture passed down through blood rather than ink. According to them, their grandfather's visions from God revealed a holy unity. One woman chosen to represent the female vessel, joined not with one husband but with two. Together they formed the perfect triangle, the masculine, the feminine, and the divine purpose that bound them. Miriam sat cross-legged on the parlor floor as Eli unrolled a scroll filled with looping, old-fashioned handwriting. "This is the oldest teaching," he whispered, "the one the world forgot." Micah stood by the window, watching the gray sky as if waiting for a sign to confirm what Eli read aloud. "One body, two stewards. The vessel must obey both equally and without question, for she is the bridge between them and the higher order." At first, Miriam tried to protest, not loudly. She had learned what happened when she raised her voice, but with hesitation, with questions that stopped halfway through. "But why? Why two?" she asked once. Eli only smiled and said, "Because love divided is still whole when the soul is chosen." From that moment on, her days were consumed by repetition. Long hours copying lines from the Ashwell scriptures, kneeling until her knees ached on cold wooden floors. She chanted hymns written by a man long dead, whose face she had only seen in a single faded photograph, an old preacher with hollow eyes and a crooked cross carved into his collar. Her nights were split too. One evening she would lie silent beside Eli, who whispered sermons until she fell asleep, and the next she would be led to Micah's room, where he said nothing at all, but held her hand like it was a contract signed in flesh. Neither room held mirrors. That was on purpose. "You don't need to see yourself," Micah said once, his voice low, "because you are no longer yourself." She had stopped keeping count of the days. Her memories of anything before the lodge began to blur, names and faces thinning into dreams. Her hands, once strong from gardening and drawing, were now soft and still, stained by candle wax and ink. She wore white now, always. The brothers called it bridal purity, but it didn't feel like clothing. It felt like surrender, and yet in the quietest part of her mind, something still resisted, a pulse of doubt buried deep beneath the conditioning, beneath the prayers and silence, a part of her that whispered, "You were not born for this." But in Morning House, even doubt had to be hidden, especially from oneself. The house smelled of clove oil and burning wood that night. The entire upstairs hallway had been cleared. No light but candle fire, no sound but chanting from an old cassette that spun like it was possessed. The brothers moved with a slow, synchronized rhythm. Eli held a small wooden box, the kind used to store family treasures. Micah carried a folded garment of pale linen. Miriam stood at the center of the great room, dressed in nothing but the ceremonial shift they had stitched from old altar cloths. Her hands trembled, but her face had learned not to flinch. Obedience had a rhythm now. It was easier to follow the steps than to ask questions no one would answer. Eli opened the box and revealed 2 gold rings. They looked older than both of them, fancy and dented by time. "These belong to our great-uncles," he said, placing one on her right hand. 2 men, 1 bride, as it was in the beginning. Micah stepped forward, slower, always quieter. He slid the second ring onto her left hand, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. She thought she saw pity there, or maybe just exhaustion. "You belong to us both now," he whispered. "You are the link." The ceremony didn't end there. Eli took out a small rusted tool, a branding iron no bigger than a finger, shaped like a twisted figure 8. He called it the vow. Micah steadied Miriam by the shoulders. She wanted to scream, to tear herself away, but she didn't. She had learned that silence earned smaller punishments. They heated the metal over the fireplace. The chanting grew louder, as if the tape itself responded to what was about to happen. And then, in a moment that collapsed her into a haze of fire and breathless sickness, the symbol was pressed into her back, not deep enough to scar like flesh, but just enough to leave a mark that would never fully fade. After it was done, they wrapped her in a thin white shawl and led her upstairs, where a mirror had been covered in black cloth. "You are not her anymore," Eli said. "Her name is Sin. You must never speak it." "What is my name now?" Miriam asked. Micah looked to his brother, who smiled and said, "You are bride." She was not allowed to ask again. In the weeks that followed, her voice thinned out like mist. She stopped humming the songs she used to know. Her hands forgot how to write. The rings stayed on her fingers like chains made pretty, and the vow pulsed like a second spine, an invisible line between who she had been and what she was now. Her past life slipped away, not in fire or fury, but like fog in the sun. And by the time she stood again at the foot of the chapel altar, even she had begun to wonder if bride was all she had ever been. There were nights when the air inside Morning House felt thinner, like the house itself was holding its breath. Miriam had grown used to the weight of silence, the scraping of footsteps above her room. The dull hum of prayers played on loop. But lately the silence felt different. Looser, less watched. Eli's sermons had grown longer. Micah had started sleeping earlier, and when the doors creaked shut upstairs and the voices faded behind plaster walls, Miriam began to move. She timed her steps to the groans of the old house, slipping past the chapel door and down a side hallway that had always been locked. But this time, the door stood slightly open. Inside, dust clung to the air like spider webs. The light from her candle cast soft circles on the wallpaper, which peeled like old skin. She hesitated at the first bend, then followed the narrow hallway deeper into the bones of the house. That's when she saw the faces. Portraits lined both sides of the hallway, framed in wood that had darkened with age. Each one of a woman in a wedding gown. None of them were labeled. Some faces were turned slightly. Some stared directly ahead. Some smiled faintly, while others looked hollow. Miriam moved slowly from one to the next, her fingers brushing the glass. Blonde, brunette, redhead, dark-skinned, pale. The only thing they all had in common was the dress and the absence of a name. A draft blew through the hallway, cold and wet with the scent of something buried. She turned toward a narrow wooden door at the end of the hallway. It opened without resistance, revealing a cramped room with a slanted ceiling and faded wallpaper patterned with vines. At the center sat a music box, its lid already cracked open. She knelt beside it, fingers hovering over the handle. When she twisted it, the lullaby it played wasn't like the hymns she was forced to memorize. It was softer, sorrowful, a melody wrapped in regret. Then the voice began. It was faint, recorded decades ago, but unmistakably female. "This house has many wives," it said. "Some stay, some vanish, none forget." Miriam froze. The music continued as the voice repeated the phrase softer each time, like a warning sinking into the floorboards. She looked up at the room's slanted ceiling and noticed scratched writings behind the wallpaper. Letters, names, dozens of them, some half erased, others fully carved, all written in hands not her own. A sharp creak echoed from upstairs and the hallway moaned again. Panic surged, but Miriam forced herself to move quietly. Closing the music box and returning it to its place, she backed out of the room, eyes still darting toward the faceless brides who lined the walls. As she slipped back through the main hallway and into her room, the silence returned. But this time, it had changed. It was no longer just a silence of obedience. Now it was the silence of knowing she was not alone. The rain started before sunrise. A slow tapping against the attic glass that grew heavier with each passing hour. By afternoon, the storm had swallowed the mountains, dragging wind through the chimney and battering the shutters until they moaned. Water crept beneath the front door and soaked through the floorboards, spreading like veins through the decaying wood. By nightfall, Morning House had surrendered. The basement groaned under the weight of rainwater, a sound that woke Miriam from her restless sleep. She pulled on her damp dress, lit a candle, and followed the sound downward, past the hallway of faces, past the boarded chapel, down into the stone stairwell leading to the cellar. The door had always been bolted, but now it hung half open. She stepped into ankle-deep water, shivering as the cold seeped through her bones. The candlelight flickered against brick walls covered with moss. Broken shelves lined one side, toppled trunks and rusted tools strewn across the floor. A low hum came from the far corner, beneath a collapsed beam where the flooding had torn open part of the foundation. There, partially underwater, was a wooden crate. Miriam waded toward it, fingers trembling as she pried it open. Inside were books swollen with mold, yellowing pages curling at the edges, and several old tapes in rusted tins. One diary, still mostly intact, bore a name in faded ink: Sarah L., 1954. She clutched the diary to her chest and carried the tapes up the stairs, dripping and breathless. In a storage room behind the study, she found an old tape player covered in a moth-eaten cloth. It hissed when she powered it on, coughing static before the tape began. A woman's voice broke through, softer than the one on the music box, but unmistakably human. "I am Sarah," it began. "I came to Morning House when I was 17. They said I was special, said I would bring harmony to their bloodline. They told me they were brothers by flesh, but spirits of one man." Miriam sat frozen, eyes locked on the spinning reels. "They carved the vow into my skin, told me to forget my parents, that my name was too loud for holiness. I wore white, I prayed, I endured, until I found the others." Click. The tape cut off. Miriam pressed her hands to her mouth. She read the diary next, flipping page after page until her fingers blackened with rot. Sarah's entries mirrored her own life. Identical rituals, identical punishments, except these Ashwell brothers were named Josiah and Nathaniel. Different names, same bloodline, same teaching. Miriam leaned back, dizzy. It wasn't just her. It never had been. This sickness, this religion, it was a legacy. She turned the final page. It was smeared with dried mud and blood. Only 3 words were readable. "You are next." A bolt of thunder cracked outside, but Miriam didn't flinch. For the first time in years, her fear burned cold, controlled. She blew out the candle and sat in the dark, gripping Sarah's diary like a lifeline. Somewhere upstairs, footsteps echoed again. Heavy, familiar. But now, Miriam wasn't just a bride. She was the last in a long line of survivors. It began with the glass. The storm had passed, leaving behind a quiet that pressed too tightly against the walls of Morning House. The air was still heavy, but the rain had stopped, and the clouds that covered the mountains began to unravel into patches of reluctant sunlight. Miriam stood by the west hallway where a small sealed window had long been painted over. With trembling hands, she picked up a rusted fireplace poker and struck it hard. The crack was sharp, like a bone breaking. Shards fell to the floor, catching the light like broken teeth. She picked up one of the larger pieces, jagged, oval-shaped, and angled it toward her face. The woman staring back was not the girl who had walked into Morning House so many years ago. Her cheekbones were sharper now, as if carved from grief. Her eyes, once soft and brown, were dulled, ringed in sleepless shadow. There was a scar across her chin she didn't remember getting. Her hair had grown long and wild, threaded with silver, even though she was barely past 30. And her lips, they were thin from silence, not smiling in years. She blinked, The face blinked back. It took her several minutes before she could whisper aloud, "That's me." That night, while the brothers slept, Eli snoring in his usual armchair, and Micah collapsed in the chapel after too much cider, Miriam crept through the house, holding the glass shard close, not as a weapon, but as a truth, a reflection. She started behind the wallpaper in the drawing room, peeling it back carefully with a knife until the wooden panels were exposed. With the tip of a nail, she carved the words, "I am not your bride." Then again in the music room behind a faded portrait of a woman in white with eyes too wide, "You cannot keep me." And again above the cellar door, "Sarah lived. I will too." It became a ritual. Each night one new carving, one more hidden truth beneath the skin of the house. Sometimes she used charcoal, sometimes her own blood. On especially daring nights, she whispered the words aloud as she wrote them, savoring the sound of defiance. By the end of the week, there were 15 messages scattered throughout Morning House, tucked behind frames and under stair treads, inside the hymn book bindings, and even scratched into the underside of the dinner table. She began to walk taller. She began to smile. Not often, not fully, but enough that Micah noticed. "You've been quieter than usual," he muttered over breakfast one morning, eyeing her like she was a clock ticking out of rhythm. Miriam met his gaze. "I've been listening," she said softly. "To who?" "Myself." That night she placed the shard of mirror beneath her pillow like a holy relic, and for the first time in years, she dreamed not of prayers or fire or the whisper of veils, but of her own voice echoing through the hollow halls. "You are not theirs. You never were." She waited for the right night. For weeks, Miriam had watched Micah's habits, how he ate without grace, shoveling food into his mouth while Eli prayed over his portion, how he never questioned a stew left unattended, never noticed if it tasted off. Eli, on the other hand, inspected every bite, as if God himself sat beside him, judging the meal. The key was in the cellar, a rusted tin marked cleaning lye, tucked behind the shelves of canned peaches and pickled cucumbers. She had passed it many times before, but never with purpose. Now, the purpose was sharp and undeniable. That evening, the sky was low and yellowed, unnatural, like the hour before a tornado. Thunder rumbled in the distance, but the storm would not come. It only hung there, heavy. Dinner was a rabbit stew. She stirred in the lye while Eli knelt in the parlor for evening prayers, his voice muffled behind the thick wood of the chapel door. She added more salt than usual, enough to hide the sting. Her hands trembled, but only once. When they sat to eat, Micah devoured his bowl in minutes. Eli sipped carefully, sniffed the spoon, and pushed it away. "Too salty," he muttered. Micah didn't speak again. He clutched his gut, stood up too fast, and knocked over the tin plate with a clang that rang through the whole house. He staggered, foamed at the mouth, collapsed across the table, dragging the oil lamp with him. Flames licked the tablecloth, but sputtered out in the spilled broth. Eli screamed, first in confusion, then in horror, and shoved his brother's body onto the floor, trying to revive him, but Miriam didn't move. She stood across the room, hands clasped, face eerily calm. "You did this," Eli gasped. She looked him in the eye. "No," she said quietly. "You did." He grabbed her by the wrist, dragging her through the hallway, past the staircase and the cracked window she had once turned into a mirror. Her feet barely touched the ground. He flung open the chapel door, the old one with peeling paint and the faint scent of mildew and dried flowers, and shoved her inside. The room was still draped in lace and dust. The floorboards groaned in protest as he locked the heavy door behind her. "You will kneel," he hissed. "You will beg." Miriam turned to face the altar, where once she had been made to wear a veil and repeat vows written by a man long buried, and sat calmly on the floor. She did not cry. She did not plead. "You think this is over?" Eli shouted through the door. "You think killing him frees you?" She closed her eyes and whispered, "It already has." Silence fell again in Morning House. No footsteps down the hall, no voices in the kitchen, only the faint echo of rain beginning once more, tapping against the window like a gentle reminder. Outside, The storm that had been holding its breath finally let go. Inside, Miriam sat alone in the chapel. Not broken, not bride, but something else entirely. It had always been the missing pieces that shaped Ruth's life. She never knew her mother. Her file said Jane Doe, and the hospital records stopped after 1985. The rest was a shuffle through foster homes, sealed court documents, and questions no one could answer, until the envelope arrived. A yellowed letter with no return address, postmarked from a town she had never heard of, Ash Hollow, North Carolina. Inside was a single sentence handwritten in fading ink. Your mother's name was Miriam Ashwell. You are not forgotten. It felt like a prank. Or worse, bait. But the DNA results confirmed the impossible. Ruth was connected by blood to the Ashwell family, who, according to a brief internet search, had vanished decades ago after whispers of cult behavior in a house hidden deep in the woods. Morning House. She drove out on a gray October afternoon. The trees along the mountain road were bare, clawing at the car as she passed. GPS cut out 10 miles before she reached the long dirt path that curved like a question mark toward the hill. The house was still there. It leaned like a tired old animal, half sunk into the earth, its shutters loose and banging in the wind. Vines crept up the siding and the paint had all but peeled away. Yet something about it felt waiting. Ruth stepped inside. The air was thick and metallic, as if time had not only passed here but rotted. Her boots cracked across the warped floorboards. Rooms were left as they had been decades ago. Drapes rotting over shattered windows, dishes still in the sink. Then she saw the door to the chapel. The wood was dark and swollen with age. The hinges rusted. She pushed it open. What greeted her was not decay. It was intention. The room had been preserved almost carefully. At the front, nailed to the wall above a crumbling altar, was a wedding veil. Its lace was brittle, stained at the edges, but unmistakably a veil. Beneath it, carved into the wood in uneven, frantic handwriting, I am not your bride. Ruth's breath caught in her throat. She stepped closer, fingers brushing the edge of the fabric. A whisper of movement stirred behind her. But when she turned, the room was still empty, and yet she didn't feel alone. Kneeling, she saw a name scratched into the baseboard beneath the altar. Miriam. This was no prank, no mistake. The pieces of her life, the absences, the silences, the unexplained nightmares, were not imaginary. They were fragments of someone else's captivity, someone who had left behind more than just blood. Ruth stood in the silence of that chapel, veil still swaying gently above her, and understood that whatever her mother had endured, whatever had kept her voiceless for so long, it ended now, because she had returned and something was waiting for her to find it. The silence in Morning House had changed. It no longer felt like neglect or abandonment. It felt like breath held in waiting, like something buried beneath the boards had stirred when Ruth entered. She moved through the dim halls with cautious steps, feeling the eyes of old ghosts in every creak of wood. The chapel behind her still smelled faintly of mildew and ash. The veil she had touched now lay folded in her bag. It felt wrong to leave it behind. She wasn't sure why. She entered what must have once been a study. Bookshelves buckled under the weight of water damage. Dust blanketed everything, but one corner of the floor, directly beneath a faded portrait, looked off. A slight bulge, a loosened nail. She knelt and pried the board loose with trembling fingers. Beneath it was a box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside, a leather-bound journal with the title burned into its cover, The Book of Brides. The spine cracked. She opened it. The first page was dated 1927. A woman's name was written in delicate handwriting, followed by details of a ritual, a binding, and something called the Dual Covenant. Ruth flipped forward, each name followed by similar descriptions. The veil, the carving, the shared vows between two men. Each woman had been brought to this place. Each had been told she was chosen. Each had her identity erased and rewritten under the Ashwell teaching. The handwriting changed over the decades, but the language remained the same, eerily respectful, disturbingly careful. And then, Miriam Ashwell. Her mother's name was written in shakier handwriting, almost rushed. The entry was incomplete. Just beneath it, Ruth found one more name, her own. No date, no ritual, just her name, inked like a final warning. And then the last page, a message centered on the yellowing paper, written in firm, determined handwriting. If you are reading this, break the cycle. She stared at those words until her vision blurred. There was no scream, no dramatic gasp, just a slow rising heat of understanding. Morning House wasn't abandoned. It was paused, preserved, waiting for the next bride, the next vessel, the next chapter, but not anymore. Ruth stood in silence for a long moment, then walked to the kitchen, opened the old gas valve, and poured the remaining kerosene from the back shed across the wooden floors. The flames would spread quickly in the dry air. She struck a match and watched it catch on the edge of the Book of Brides, the pages curling like dry leaves. As fire bloomed around her, she walked outside and turned to face the house. The flames rose orange and fierce, eating the roof like the mouth of something finally allowed to scream. She didn't cry. She smiled, not out of joy but out of release. Miriam's silence had ended here. So had every name written in that cursed book. The line was broken, not with words, but with fire. She got into her car, veil still folded beside her, and drove down the dirt path without looking back. If this story haunted you the way it haunted us, click the like button and subscribe to the channel. We share the dark truths history tried to forget and the voices it tried to silence. See you tomorrow.